In a town where old prejudices still lingered, a gang set their sights on taking control. To them, the quiet mechanic was just another shop owner, a black man in a place that never fully welcomed him, an easy target who would bow like the rest. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Before he walked away from war, he was a Delta Force commander, a man forged in combat, trained to eliminate threats before they even saw him coming. When they burned his shop to the ground, they thought they had broken him. They were wrong. As he hunted them down, dismantling their grip on the town piece by piece, something darker surfaced, a ghost from his past, a vendetta waiting to be settled. The gang was only the beginning. The real war had been waiting for him all along. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe. The air inside Vassar Auto Repair was thick with the familiar scent of oil and metal. A combination that had long since become a part of Cade Vassar's existence, settling into his skin and clothing the way old memories did. Permanent, inescapable. The rhythmic ticking of a cooling engine filled the otherwise quiet space. The last job of the day finished. The tools neatly arranged in their proper places. He took a moment to wipe his hands, feeling the weight of the day in his muscles. The kind of exhaustion that was satisfying in a way that violence never had been. He preferred it this way, preferred the hum of an engine over the whistle of a bullet, the smell of gasoline over the acrid burn of gunpowder. This shop wasn't just where he worked. It was where he rebuilt himself, piece by piece, after walking away from a life that had trained him to be something else, something dangerous. It hadn't been easy, but nothing ever was for a man like him. The town had been hesitant to accept him at first. A black man owning a business in a neighborhood where old money still whispered in back rooms and looked down on people like him, it had been an uphill battle from the start. Some customers wouldn't even step foot inside, taking their cars to mechanics they trusted. And he had learned early on that no matter how much respect he had earned overseas, it didn't buy him anything here. But he hadn't let that stop him. Over the years, he had won over the ones who mattered. The working men and women who didn't care about the color of his skin as long as he did the job right. They came to him because they knew he wouldn't cheat them, that he'd fix what needed fixing, and wouldn't overcharge them for things they didn't need. They respected the way he ran things, the way he treated people, and yet the neighborhood was changing. He had started noticing it a few months ago, the way businesses that had been around for decades were suddenly closing down. Owners who had spent their lives here packing up and leaving without much explanation. He had heard the whispers, the ones about a new gang taking over, about men who didn't ask for permission, only obedience. Then, earlier that day, they had come for him. Cade sat on the edge of his workbench, the rag in his hands nearly threadbare from the way he had been absent-mindedly twisting it between his fingers. The shop was quiet now, the last car repaired and picked up, the tools lined up neatly on the wall. It was the kind of silence he had learned to appreciate, the kind that made him feel in control, where the only problems he had to solve were mechanical, logical, things that could be fixed with the right tools and patience. But outside these walls, the neighborhood was changing. The signs had been there for months. Storefronts closing down with little explanation, business owners leaving town overnight, sometimes selling, sometimes just vanishing. He had heard the murmurs at the diner, the way people spoke in hushed voices about men they didn't recognize hanging around, about the kind of trouble that didn't come with warnings, only consequences. At first, he had ignored it. Not because he didn't care, but because he had spent too many years fighting other people's battles, getting involved in things that only left scars. He had built this shop to leave that part of himself behind, to be something other than a soldier or a weapon. Then, a few days ago, he had started hearing his own name in those whispers. At first, it was indirect, customers mentioning that some people had been asking about the shop, about whether Cade was planning to sell. A man he had known for years, an old-timer named Henry, who ran a hardware store 2 blocks down, had mentioned it first, his voice edged with something close to fear. "You ain't thinking of leaving, are you, Cade?" Cade had frowned at the question. Why would I? Henry had shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the door as if someone might be listening. Because they're picking people off, one by one, and they've been looking at you. Cade didn't respond then, but something inside him had shifted. That evening, he noticed the car parked across the street. An older model sedan with dark-tinted windows, the engine idling just long enough to be noticed before pulling away. A test. A warning. They were watching, and that meant they were coming. Cade tossed the rag onto the workbench and walked to the back of the shop, his movements slow but deliberate. He pulled open the old, dented filing cabinet, reaching into the bottom drawer where a small, heavy safe rested beneath stacks of old paperwork. He spun the dial with practiced precision, unlocking it in seconds. Inside, wrapped in a worn piece of cloth, was his past. A pistol he hadn't touched in years. A combat knife he hadn't needed since the last time he was sent into a place where men didn't come back whole. He stared at them for a long moment, his fingers brushing against the steel before pulling away. Not yet. He wasn't ready to pick that life back up. But he had a feeling it wasn't going to be his choice. By the next morning, the trouble finally came walking through his door. It started with just one man, a lanky kid no older than 20, wearing a loose jacket and a cocky smirk, like he already knew how this was going to go. He didn't say much at first, just leaned against the doorway, looking around as if he had a stake in the place. "Nice shop," the kid said, running a hand along the door frame. "Been here long?" Cade didn't answer, just kept working on the old Ford in front of him. The kid didn't seem to mind the silence, his smirk widening. "Must be nice," he continued. "A place like this, all yours. Bet it's worth a lot these days." Cade straightened, wiping his hands on a rag before finally looking at him. "You looking to get something fixed?" The kid laughed, shaking his head. "Nah, man. I'm just here to give you a heads up. Some people are coming by later. Want to have a little chat. See where you stand." Cade kept his face unreadable. But inside, something locked into place. The kid wasn't a threat. He was just the messenger. And if they were sending messengers, that meant they still thought this was a negotiation. That was their mistake. Cade took a slow step forward, closing the space between them just enough that the kid had to straighten up, no longer leaning so casually. "Tell them I'll be here," he said quietly. "And if they want to talk, they can come to me themselves." For the first time, the kid hesitated, as if realizing this wasn't playing out the way he expected. He licked his lips, nodded quickly, and took a step back toward the door. Yeah, I'll do that." He left without another word. Cade watched him go, his jaw tightening. The next time they came, they didn't send a messenger. Cade heard them before he saw them. The deep, throaty rumble of engines crawling down the street like a slow-moving storm. He didn't need to look to know what was coming. He kept working, hands steady as he tightened the last bolt under the hood of an old Dodge, the methodical click of his wrench the only sound inside the shop. Then, the engines cut off. Car doors creaked open, boots scuffed against the pavement, and low voices carried through the air like a slow-building threat. Cade didn't need to count to know how many there were. The weight of their presence filled the space before they even stepped inside. The first man through the door was big. Not just in build, but in the way he carried himself. Broad-shouldered and thick-necked, moving with the slow, deliberate confidence of someone who believed he was untouchable. Trez Menard. He walked in first, and his men followed. 5 in total, all white, all marked by the kind of tattoos that told Cade exactly what kind of men they were. Symbols of hate, of belonging to something rotten. He had seen their kind before, both in uniform and out of it. Men who clung to the belief that the world owed them something for nothing. Men who thought power was their birthright. Trez let his gaze wander around the shop like he was inspecting something he already owned. His men fanned out, not blocking the exits, but positioning themselves in a way that made it clear they had already decided how this would end. Cade kept his eyes on his work, finishing the last bolt, wiping his hands on a rag. "Nice setup you got here," Trez said, his voice smooth but edged with something sharp. "A black man running a business like this, That's rare. Cade didn't respond. He just folded the rag slowly and set it aside. Trez smirked at the silence, nodding to himself. See? That's what I thought. You're quiet. Keep your head down. Don't cause trouble. I can respect that. He took a slow step forward. But here's the thing, he continued. This neighborhood? It's changing. We're making sure it's run right, keeping out the filth, making sure the right people are in charge. Cade's fingers flexed slightly, but he didn't move. Now, I don't got to explain what that means, do I? Trez tilted his head. Some people in town, they don't belong. They think because they bought some property, opened up a shop, that makes them one of us. But this town don't belong to them. His smirk widened, lazy and full of certainty. And it sure as heck don't belong to you. One of his men, a wiry guy with a shaved head and the look of someone who enjoyed hurting people, chuckled. Man, look at him. He don't even look mad. He thinks if he keeps quiet, we'll just let him be. Trez sighed, shaking his head. I was hoping we could work something out. Give you a chance to walk away on your own terms. Would have been the respectful thing to do. But if you're not smart enough to take a hint, well, he gestured around the shop. We'll just have to show you how things work. Cade finally met his gaze, steady, unblinking. That's supposed to scare me? Trez's smirk twitched. That reaction wasn't what he expected. You should be scared, the wiry man sneered, stepping closer, invading Cade's space. 'Cause if you think this is your town, your business, your life, his hand shot out, aiming for Cade's shoulder, trying to shove him back. That was the mistake. Cade moved. His left hand shot up, deflecting the grab before it even landed. His right fist came next, slamming into the man's ribs with a force that sent a deep, painful crack through the air. The wiry man barely had time to suck in a breath before Cade grabbed him by the collar, yanked him forward, and drove a knee into his stomach. The man collapsed with a gasping wheeze, folding in on himself like a rag doll. Then the room exploded. One of the others lunged at him, big, fast, throwing a heavy punch aimed straight for Cade's jaw. Cade stepped inside the swing, catching the man's wrist, twisting hard, snapping it to the side. A yell of pain filled the air, cut short as Cade slammed his forearm across the man's face, sending him sprawling. Another one grabbed him from behind. Cade shifted his weight, hooked his foot around the man's ankle, and whipped him off balance, sending him crashing into a stack of tools. 2 down, 2, 3 left. The fourth man, the biggest of them, barreled toward him like a freight train. Cade pivoted, letting the man's own momentum work against him. At the last second, he sidestepped, caught the back of his head, and drove him face first into the hood of the Dodge. Metal dented. The man slumped. And then there was just Trez. Cade turned slowly, breathing steady, his pulse hammering but controlled. He rolled his shoulders, adjusting his stance as he faced the last man standing. Trez hadn't moved yet. His smirk was gone now, replaced with something colder, calculating. He looked around at his fallen men, then back at Cade. And then, without a word, he took off his jacket. Trez shrugged off his jacket, rolling his shoulders like a man who had been waiting for this moment. His movements were slow, deliberate, not rushed or reckless like his men had been. Cade recognized it immediately. This man knew how to fight. The others had been enforcers, street-level muscle who relied on fear more than skill. But Trez, he was different. He stepped forward, his stance shifting ever so slightly. Balanced, controlled. He wasn't just some thug swinging wildly. He had been trained. "You think you're special?" Trez muttered, rolling his neck until it cracked. "You think being some tough black war hero means you belong here?" He took another step forward, lowering his center of gravity, eyes locked on Cade. "You're just a guest in my town." Then he moved, fast. Trez's right hand came in first, a sharp, straight jab aimed at Cade's chin. A setup. Cade dodged, but the moment he leaned away, Trez was already following up with a left hook. Fast, precise. It connected. The impact cracked against Cade's jaw, his head snapping to the side. The taste of iron bloomed in his mouth. Trez didn't give him time to recover. He pressed forward, throwing a knee into Cade's ribs, driving the breath from his lungs. But Cade wasn't just taking hits. He absorbed the impact, rolling with it, letting his body redirect the force rather than fight against it. Then he struck back. Trez's right hand came again, another jab. But this time, Cade didn't dodge. He caught it. With a sharp twist of his wrist, he trapped Trez's arm and pulled him forward, slamming his forehead into Trez's nose. The sound was wet and sharp. Trez grunted, stumbling back, blood now trickling down his upper lip, but he recovered fast. Cade barely had time to reposition before Trez lunged again, grabbing him in a clinch, trying to use his weight to drive Cade back against the workbench. Cade planted his feet, twisting his hips to break the grip before driving an elbow into the side of Trez's head. Trez staggered. Cade followed up with a sharp palm strike to the throat, not enough to crush it, but enough to disrupt his breathing for a second. Trez coughed, his stance faltering, a crack in the armor. Cade pressed forward. He threw a hard right hook to the ribs, felt the satisfying impact against bone. Another shot to the solar plexus. Then Trez adjusted. With sudden force, he drove his shoulder into Cade's chest, knocking him backward. Cade barely had time to react before Trez's fist came again, slamming into his ribs. Hard. Pain flared up Cade's side, but he gritted his teeth. Trez moved in to capitalize, throwing a wild overhand right. Too slow. Cade dipped under it, hooked his foot around Trez's ankle, and swept his legs out from under him. Trez hit the concrete hard. Cade didn't hesitate. He dropped onto him, pinning his arm before driving his fist down. Once, twice, 3 times. Each punch landed clean, sharp impacts against Trez's jaw. But the man was tough. With a growl, Trez bucked, twisting his hips, rolling Cade over. Now, Trez was on top. He wasted no time, slamming an elbow down into Cade's face. Cade felt his vision flash white for a second. Trez's hands wrapped around his throat. "Should have stayed in your place," he hissed, squeezing tight. Cade's breath vanished. The pressure was immense, fingers digging into his windpipe. He felt his pulse hammering against the grip, felt the world closing in. But he wasn't done. He forced his legs up, hooking them around Trez's body before twisting his hips. The shift in weight sent both of them rolling again, Cade back on top. But this time, he ended it. Cade's left arm wrapped around the back of Trez's neck, pulling him forward into a tight guillotine choke. Trez gasped, his body jerking as he tried to push free. But Cade locked it in tighter. The veins in Trez's neck bulged. His grip weakened, his legs kicked. And then, his body slackened. Cade let go. Trez slumped onto the ground, barely conscious, his chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. Cade sat back, inhaling deeply, wiping blood from his mouth. His ribs ached, his jaw throbbed, but he was still standing. The others, the ones he had already dropped, were watching now, stunned, uncertain. For the first time, they saw what they were dealing with. Cade exhaled, rolling his shoulders before rising to his feet. He stepped over Trez's barely moving body and looked at the rest of them, his voice calm, steady. "Get out!" No one moved at first. Then, slowly, one by one, they did. They hauled Trez up, dragging him toward the door. Before they left, Trez turned his head, his eyes still burning despite his bruised face. "This ain't over," he rasped. Then he was gone. Cade stood there for a long moment, rolling his jaw, feeling the pain settle in. The next morning, when Cade unlocked the front door of his shop, something felt wrong. It was subtle, the kind of thing most people wouldn't notice. The faintest shift in the air, the smallest inconsistencies in the way he had left things the night before. His tools, always meticulously arranged, were slightly off. A few wrenches pushed just an inch out of place. His workbench drawer, which he always closed until it was flush, was left slightly ajar, as if someone had been inside and left in a hurry, and then he saw it. Scrawled across the back wall, Written in something thick and black, maybe oil, maybe something worse, was a single word: leave. Cade stood there for a long moment, staring at the crude letters, his mind working through the implications. Someone had broken into his shop, not to rob it, not to wreck it, but to leave a message, to make it clear that they weren't done with him, that they expected him to fold, to pack up and go quietly like so many others before him. He exhaled slowly, walking to his workbench with unhurried movements, picking up a rag and wiping the wall clean. If this was their first warning, they had already made a mistake. Warnings only worked on people who were afraid. And Cade wasn't afraid, but they weren't finished. Over the next few days, the pressure mounted in ways that were too deliberate to be dismissed as coincidence. His truck's tires were slashed one night, 4 clean cuts across the rubber that told him whoever did it had taken their time. He replaced them without a word. The next morning, he found his mailbox ripped out of the ground and bent in half. The metal twisted like it had been pried apart with bare hands or a crowbar. He set it back up and moved on. Then, the whispers started. Customers he had known for years began avoiding his shop. Their words clipped, their eyes darting toward the door as if they were waiting for someone to walk in and catch them speaking to him. They left quickly, some making flimsy excuses, others simply turning away without saying anything at all. And then there was Henry. The old man had been coming to Cade's shop since the first day he opened, always bringing his old Chevy in for a tune-up, always making small talk about the town and the way things used to be. But when Cade saw him in the grocery store parking lot that afternoon, there was a tightness in the way he walked, a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. Henry pulled him aside, voice low, eyes scanning the lot like he expected someone to be watching. "You need to leave, son," he muttered. "They ain't gonna stop. They're making it clear. You either give in, or they'll take you apart, piece by piece." Cade studied him for a long moment, watching the way his hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "You talking about Trez?" Henry swallowed, his expression darkening. "I'm talking about whoever's pulling the strings. Trez ain't just some punk with a bunch of thugs. He's getting orders, and he's following them." Cade frowned, the weight of Henry's words settling into place. "Orders from who?" Henry hesitated, his face going pale. "I don't know, and I don't want to know." He sighed heavily, rubbing a hand down his face. "You're a good man, Cade, but you can't fight the whole world. Think about what you're risking here." Then he turned and walked away, leaving Cade standing in the parking lot with the knowledge that this wasn't just about business, wasn't just about a fight between men with different ideas of ownership. This was bigger. And then came the fire. It happened 3 nights later. Cade had been sleeping light ever since the trouble started, a habit he had never fully shaken from his time overseas, the kind of instinct that never truly left a man once it had been sharpened enough. So when the sound came, a muffled pop, like a small explosion, his eyes were open before his brain had even caught up. Then came the smell, smoke. His heart slammed against his ribs as he shoved his boots on and bolted for the door, his legs carrying him faster than his mind could process. But the moment he reached the street, the sight of it hit him with full force. His shop was burning. Flames had already swallowed the front half of the building, the heat rolling off in suffocating waves, the glow casting long, flickering shadows against the pavement. He could hear glass shattering, metal groaning as the fire ate through the structure that had taken him years to build. The roof, once sturdy and solid, had begun to sag, flames licking hungrily at its edges, threatening to cave it in at any moment. The scent of burning rubber, of scorched oil and gasoline, filled the air, thick and acrid, stinging his throat as he took a step forward, helpless to do anything but watch. Neighbors had come out of their homes, standing in their doorways or huddled in small groups, their faces illuminated by the fire. Some of them were whispering, others just watching in silence. Someone had called the fire department, but Cade knew it wouldn't matter. It was too late. And then Through the waves of heat, through the smoke and chaos, a car rolled past. It moved slowly, deliberately, its tinted windows too dark to see inside. But Cade didn't need to. He already knew who was watching. The flames crackled louder, the heat intensifying, and as Cade took another step forward, he felt the sharp sting of embers hitting his skin. The fire was alive now, raging, devouring, refusing to be controlled. And it wasn't finished yet. The heat still lingered in the air by the time the fire had finally begun to die. The night sky, once clear and quiet, was now thick with smoke, rising in ghostly tendrils from the charred remains of Wasser Auto Repair. The fire department had arrived too late to do anything but keep the blaze from spreading, and even now, hours later, small embers still glowed beneath the collapsed metal beams and scorched remains of what had once been Cade's livelihood. He stood at the edge of the destruction, hands at his sides, body tense but still, his eyes locked on the blackened husk of his shop. The walls were gone, reduced to skeletal remains that barely stood against the weight of the damage. The garage doors had caved inward, twisted into grotesque shapes by the heat, and everything inside, his tools, his equipment, years of work, had been swallowed by the inferno. The firefighters were still wrapping up their work, moving through the wreckage with slow, methodical steps. Most of the flames had been doused, but the wreckage still smoldered, hissing every time water from their hoses hit a pocket of embers. Cade could feel the weight of their gazes on him. Pity, maybe, or silent questions they were too professional to ask. One of them, a tall man with a soot-streaked uniform and weary eyes, finally approached, adjusting the strap of his helmet as he stopped a few feet away. "You the owner?" Cade didn't take his eyes off the shop. "Yeah," the firefighter exhaled, glancing back at the wreckage before speaking. "We contained it as best we could, but there wasn't much to save. Fire spread too fast, too hot. Whoever did this knew what they were doing." Cade's jaw clenched slightly. What was the source? The firefighter hesitated, then nodded toward the side of the building. "Started near the rear entrance. Accelerant was used. Gasoline, maybe something stronger. There was an ignition device, most likely a Molotov or something similar. We'll have to confirm once the inspectors come through. But this wasn't an accident." Cade had already known that. Still, hearing it confirmed sent something cold through his veins. Not anger, not yet. Something deeper, something sharper. "Arson?" he asked, voice low. "Without a doubt." The firefighter wiped a hand across his forehead, sighing. "We see a lot of fires in this job. But this was personal." Cade knew that too. He stepped forward then, moving past the firefighter before the man could tell him not to, stepping carefully over fallen beams and shattered glass. The ground beneath his boots was still warm, the air thick with the scent of burned metal and rubber, but he didn't slow down. He needed to see it for himself. His steps took him toward the back of the shop, where the fire had started. The structure almost entirely collapsed in on itself. The rear door had been blown inward, its hinges warped. The metal buckled from the heat. Then he saw it, buried beneath the charred remains of his tool cabinets and workbenches, just barely visible under a pile of fallen debris. Something small, round, and metallic. He crouched, brushing away the ash and soot, fingers wrapping around the object as he pulled it free. A scorched glass bottle. The bottom was shattered, the edges jagged, but the neck and body remained intact, the faint scent of gasoline still clinging to the inside. A Molotov. They had done this the old-fashioned way. Up close, personal. They hadn't used a bomb or some remote detonation. They had walked up to his shop, thrown this inside, and stood back to watch it burn. His grip tightened around the bottle. A deliberate choice. A message. He turned the glass in his hands, eyes scanning the surface, and that's when he saw it. A smudged fingerprint, barely visible beneath the soot. Whoever had thrown this had been sloppy. Cade exhaled slowly, lowering the bottle as he rose to his feet. He had enough training to know that fingerprints wouldn't be fully usable in this state, but that didn't matter. He didn't need a perfect print. He didn't need police reports or evidence files. He already knew who was behind this. Trez had sent his people to burn him out, to leave him with nothing, to send the message that there was no place for him here. But Trez had made one mistake. He had left Cade standing. And now, it was Cade's turn. The night stretched long and heavy over the town, pressing down in a silence that felt unnatural, the kind of stillness that signaled something had already happened, something irreversible, something violent. The smell of smoke still clung to the air, faint but lingering, a cruel reminder that even though the flames had died, their message had not. Cade moved through the streets like a shadow, his presence unnoticed, his steps quiet, his focus locked onto one goal. He had been watching for hours, waiting for the moment when one of them would be alone, waiting for a chance to extract what he needed. The gang had been celebrating ever since the fire, their confidence swelling, their guard slipping. They believed their job was done. They thought they had proven their point, but they didn't understand what kind of man they were dealing with. Richie Carter was the perfect target. He wasn't one of Trez's top men, wasn't someone whose absence would send alarms blaring, but he was close enough to the fire to know what had really happened. He had been there that night, watching, laughing, convinced he was part of something bigger than himself. He had seen the destruction firsthand, had soaked in the glow of the flames as if it were some kind of victory. And now, Cade was going to make sure he regretted it. He followed Richie from the bar, watching from a distance as the man staggered slightly, the effects of alcohol slowing his reflexes, making him sloppy. He exchanged parting words with another gang member before heading toward the alley where his car was parked. Cade had already checked. No cameras, no bystanders, nowhere to run. By the time Richie realized he wasn't alone, it was already too late. Cade struck fast, his arms snapping around Richie's throat in a chokehold that was precise, controlled, the kind of technique that didn't allow for escape. He pulled him back, cutting off his air, letting the panic set in before yanking him forward and slamming him face first into the brick wall. The impact was hard enough to stun, but not knock him out, leaving him gasping, his body limp for just a moment before instinct tried to kick in. Cade didn't give him the chance. With one swift motion, he spun Richie around and drove a fist deep into his ribs, feeling the jolt of impact reverberate through bone and muscle. Richie gasped, coughing, his hands shaking as he instinctively reached to protect himself. But Cade caught his wrist, twisting it just enough to make him freeze in place. "You were at the fire," Cade said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of an unshakable certainty. Richie wheezed, his breath uneven, his mind scrambling to find a response. "Man, Cade didn't let him finish. Another strike, this time to the solar plexus, sent Richie doubling over, his body instinctively curling inward. He choked, trying to suck in air, but Cade simply pressed him back against the wall, his grip unyielding. "You know who gave the order," Cade continued, his tone never changing. "Say his name." Richie coughed violently, blinking rapidly, his panic setting in. "It was Trez! You know that!" he gasped, his voice carrying just a hint of desperation. "He said you needed to be taught a lesson. That—" Cade wasn't interested in the excuses. His hand moved quickly, slipping into Richie's jacket pocket, fingers closing around something unexpected. A phone. But this wasn't the cheap burner that most of Trez's men carried. Wasn't the kind of disposable device criminals used when they didn't want to be traced. When Cade pulled it out, he immediately knew something was wrong. The phone was sleek, unbranded, encrypted, nothing that should have been in the hands of a street-level enforcer. Richie saw it and froze. "Don't!" The word barely left his lips before he swallowed hard, his pupils dilating as pure fear seeped into his expression. Cade turned the phone over in his hand, his mind already piecing together the implications. He tapped the screen, but it required a passcode. Locked. He tried another button, and the screen flickered, showing an unknown message in a language he didn't immediately recognize. "What is this?" Cade asked, his grip on Richie's collar tightening. Richie's breath hitched. "I don't know," he stammered. "Trez gave it to us, but he didn't want to keep it. Said it wasn't ours to have. Said it—" He hesitated, his whole body locking up, his fear deepening in a way that told Cade this was bigger than just some gang orders. Cade's voice dropped lower. "Said it was what?" Richie shuddered, sweat beading at his temple. His hands twitched slightly, his throat bobbing as he swallowed, his mind torn between whatever had scared him more, the unknown force behind this phone or the man holding him against the wall. "This wasn't about you," Richie whispered, his voice barely above a breath, his words shaking as if speaking them aloud made them real. Cade's jaw tightened. "What did you just say?" Richie exhaled shakily, his body trembling now. This wasn't about you." His voice caught, and the panic in his face deepened. "He wanted you to wake up." The silence that followed was suffocating, the weight of the words pressing into the air like a blade against the skin. Cade didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe for a long moment, letting the words settle, letting the meaning behind them dig deep. This wasn't about revenge. This wasn't about territory. This was a setup. Someone had orchestrated this from the very beginning. Someone who wanted Cade to react, to fight back, to see the flames and the destruction, and understand that it had never been about taking something from him. It had been about forcing him into the game. And now, standing there with an encrypted phone in his hand and a gang member shaking in his grasp, Cade knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whoever he was, Cade was going to find him. And when he did, there would be no hiding. The night had stretched into morning by the time Cade made it back to his safe house, a small, unmarked storage facility on the outskirts of town, tucked away behind an abandoned lot where no one would think to look. The air inside was thick with dust, the scent of rust and old oil clinging to the walls, remnants of a time when this place had been used for something other than survival. It wasn't home, but it was secure. And right now, that was all that mattered. He placed the encrypted phone on the workbench, rolling his shoulders as he took a slow breath, his ribs aching from the fight, his knuckles raw from the interrogation. But pain was secondary. Just another reminder of the war he had found himself in, a war that had begun long before the fire, before Trez's threats, before he had even realized he was being pulled into something much bigger than a turf dispute. He sat down, fingers moving across the keyboard as he powered up his laptop, plugging the phone into an external device designed to bypass encryption. It was a slow, methodical process, layers of security peeling away one at a time as he worked through the barriers protecting whatever information was inside. The device itself was unlike anything a common street thug would carry. Not a cheap burner phone passed between gang members, but something far more sophisticated, the kind of hardware used by people who understood the importance of keeping secrets. Cade watched the screen as the decryption software did its work, each step bringing him closer to the truth. Minutes stretched into an hour, and then, finally, the lock broke, and the messages appeared in a format Cade recognized all too well. There was no unnecessary chatter, no wasted words, only cold, efficient instructions, written with the kind of precision that came from a military-trained mind. The first message confirmed what he had already suspected. Someone had been watching him that night, observing his reaction to the fire, waiting for him to take action. The second message, sent hours later, suggested that the orchestrator had expected resistance, had wanted Cade to push back, as if the destruction of his shop had not been about silencing him, but about forcing him into motion. But it was the third message that made his blood run cold. It was simple, almost casual in its delivery, but the weight behind it hit him like a freight train. Whoever had sent these orders, whoever had been pulling the strings behind Trez and his men, had sent just 3 words after the fire had done its job. 3 words that turned everything Cade thought he knew on its head. He's awake now. The words settled over him like a heavy fog, thick and suffocating, the implications slamming into him all at once. This had never been about revenge or control, had never been about forcing him out of town or making an example out of him. This had been a test, a carefully constructed trap designed not to break him, but to wake him up. And then he saw the name attached to the messages, Raoul Kessler. The breath he had been holding left his lungs slowly, his fingers tightening around the edge of the workbench, his mind struggling to accept what was right in front of him. He read the name again, as if repetition would somehow make it less impossible, less absurd. But no matter how many times he stared at the screen, the name didn't change. Raoul Kessler was dead. At least, that was what Cade had believed for years. He leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose as memories he had long since buried began to rise from the depths of his past. Images of war-torn streets, of missions that had never been recorded, of decisions that had shaped the course of his life in ways he had never truly acknowledged. He and Raoul had once been more than just soldiers in the same unit, had once been brothers in arms, fighting side by side in places neither of them ever wanted to remember. But everything had changed after that mission, the one that had put Cade in the crosshairs of a truth he hadn't been ready to face. It had been classified, the details buried under layers of government red tape, but Cade had known enough to understand the stakes. The target had been labeled as high priority, a man who posed an immediate threat to their operation, someone who had to be eliminated with extreme prejudice. Cade had taken the shot, had carried out the mission without hesitation, but what he hadn't known, what no one had told him, was that the man he had killed had been Raoul's brother. The fallout had been swift. Raoul had disappeared not long after, his name written off as another casualty of war, lost in an operation that had never been fully explained. Cade had never questioned it, had never allowed himself to dwell on the possibility that there had been more to it, had never let himself wonder if Raoul had truly died that day. But now, sitting in a darkened room, staring at the proof that Raoul had not only survived, but had orchestrated everything that had happened over the last few weeks, Cade understood the truth. The fire, the threats, the calculated push that had forced him back into this world, none of it had been about revenge. It had been about bringing him back. Raoul hadn't burned down Cade's shop to take something from him. He had done it to wake him up. And Cade, gripping the edges of the workbench so tightly his knuckles turned white, realized that whatever was coming next, whatever game Raoul was playing, he was already exactly where Raoul wanted him to be. The weight of the revelation sat heavy on Cade's chest, pressing against his ribs like a slow, unrelenting vice. But he didn't let it consume him. He had spent too many years in the dark corners of the world to allow himself the luxury of hesitation. Too much time understanding how men like Raoul operated to waste a second dwelling on the past when the future demanded action. If Raoul had gone through this much trouble to drag him back into the fight, if he had set fire to Cade's life just to get his attention, then he had made one fatal miscalculation. He had given Cade a direction to move in. Cade had been forced into too many fights in his life. This one he was walking into willingly. The encrypted phone sat in the center of the workbench, the screen still glowing faintly with Raoul's messages, an invitation masked as an execution order. It wasn't enough to tell him where Raoul was, but it was a start, a thread to pull on. And Cade knew from experience that the only way to find a ghost was to follow the trail of people who were already afraid of him. He began with Trez's men. Richie had given him enough to work with. Hints about an outsider, someone even Trez was wary of, someone who had stepped into the gang's operation and made it clear that they were not in charge anymore. That alone had been enough to tell Cade what kind of force he was up against, because Trez was the kind of man who ruled through fear, and for him to be taking orders, to be nothing more than a conduit for someone else's will, meant that Raoul wasn't just working from the shadows. He was standing in plain sight, knowing no one would dare move against him. The first stop was an old warehouse on the outskirts of town, a known safe house for Trez's crew, a place where deals were made and debts were collected, where men with too much arrogance and not enough intelligence gathered because they believed no one would ever come knocking. Cade had spent enough time around men like them to know they never thought about security until it was already too late. He arrived just past midnight, moving through the darkness like a predator that had already decided the outcome of the hunt. The entrance was guarded, 2 men stationed by the loading dock, both of them more focused on their conversation than on their surroundings. Cade didn't give them the chance to realize their mistake. He moved swiftly, closing the distance in a breath, his left hand clamping down on the first man's mouth as his right arm wrapped around his throat, cutting off his air with precise pressure. The man barely had time to react before his body went limp, unconscious before he could even struggle. Cade let him drop, turning to the second man, who was just starting to process what had happened, his hand reaching for the gun at his waist. Too slow. Cade's fist connected with his ribs first, a quick, devastating blow that knocked the breath from his lungs. Before he could recover, Cade grabbed the back of his head and slammed it into the metal siding of the warehouse, watching as he crumpled to the ground in a dazed heap. The fight was over before it had even begun. He stepped inside. The inside of the warehouse was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of motor oil and sweat. The faint hum of voices carrying from the back where a few men sat around a table, counting cash and passing a bottle between them. Cade recognized one of them immediately. Luis Ortega, one of Trez's enforcers, a man who had made a career out of hurting people who didn't fall in line. Luis barely had time to turn his head before Cade had him by the throat, lifting him from his seat and slamming him onto the table, sending stacks of cash and empty bottles clattering to the floor. The other men jumped up, reaching for weapons, but Cade didn't even acknowledge them. He just squeezed. "Luis," Cade said calmly, watching the man's face redden as he clawed at Cade's grip, "you know who I am. You know why I'm here." Luis tried to shake his head, tried to force some bravado into his expression, but the truth was already written in his eyes. "You've been taking orders from a man you don't even know," Cade continued, his grip tightening just enough to make Luis wheeze. "A man Trez is afraid of. I want a name." Luis gasped, his body jerking against the pressure, but Cade didn't loosen his hold. The men around them hesitated, waiting to see if Luis would be able to handle this himself. But the moment stretched too long, and Cade could see the shift in their postures, the creeping realization that this was not a fight they wanted to be a part of. Finally, Luis choked out 2 words: "Raul Kessler." The reaction in the room was immediate. One of the men took an instinctive step back. The other exhaled sharply, his face tightening, as if he had been waiting for the name to be spoken, but had hoped it never would. The air shifted, not just with fear, but with something worse, dread. Cade leaned in, lowering his voice. "Where is he?" Luis's face twisted, sweat beading on his forehead. "I don't—" Cade slammed him back down. "Don't lie." Luis let out a ragged cough, his eyes darting to the others in the room, searching for an escape that didn't exist. His lips trembled, and for a moment Cade thought he would refuse, but then his shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him. "He's got a place outside town," Luis muttered, voice shaky. "An old compound. Used to be some kind of military storage site. He doesn't stay there long, always moving. But if you want to find him, that's where you start." Cade released him, letting him drop to the floor in a coughing heap. He didn't need to hear anything else. The road stretched long and empty ahead of him, its winding path cutting through the dense darkness of the outskirts. The low hum of the truck's engine the only sound accompanying Cade as he closed in on the location Luis Ortega had given him. His mind was sharp, focused entirely on what lay ahead. But deep in his chest, something heavy settled in place. Something that told him that no matter how well he prepared, this was not going to be a simple hunt. The moment Luis had spoken Raul's name, something had shifted. Not just in the room, but in the very air around them. as if saying it aloud had opened a door that had long been bolted shut. The men who worked under Trez weren't the type to spook easily, but their fear of Raoul had been different. It hadn't been the kind born from violent men who ruled with brutality. It had been something deeper, something that had lingered in their eyes long after Cade had walked out. Luis had given up the location of an old military storage site, a compound long since abandoned by the government, one that had once served as a holding facility for surplus equipment before funding cuts had left it to rot. Places like this were never truly forgotten, and Cade knew from experience that men like Raoul didn't pick their hideouts at random. If Raoul had chosen this place, it was because it offered more than just secrecy. It was defendable, secluded, and most importantly, easy to control. As the terrain shifted from paved roads to uneven dirt paths, Cade killed the headlights and pulled the truck to a stop just shy of the tree line, cutting the engine before stepping out. The night was thick, the air still, but even in the silence, his senses picked up the signs that someone had been here recently. Fresh tire tracks carved patterns into the dry earth. Cigarette butts littered the ground near a section of fencing that had been reinforced with newly welded metal, and the faint scent of burnt oil hung in the air. This place wasn't abandoned. It had been reactivated, repurposed for something more. He moved carefully, his body slipping into the disciplined rhythm he had spent years mastering, his steps measured, his breathing even. He kept to the shadows, following the natural contours of the terrain until he reached the perimeter, pausing just long enough to take in the scene ahead. The compound consisted of a series of squat, reinforced buildings, their rusted exteriors betraying years of neglect. But there was something unnatural about the quiet that surrounded them. There were no visible guards, no patrols moving through the lot, no sign of the usual precautions men like Raoul should have taken. It was too open, too still, and that alone sent every instinct in Cade's body on edge. The silence wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. The lack of security meant one of two things. Either Raoul had already abandoned this location, or he had prepared something that didn't require an armed presence. Cade didn't believe in easy outcomes, and he had no intention of assuming this was anything less than an invitation. Raoul wanted him here, and that meant whatever was waiting inside had already been decided long before Cade had even arrived. Moving toward the nearest building, he kept his approach deliberate, slipping through a side entrance that had been left slightly ajar, a clear invitation that did nothing to ease the tension coiling in his muscles. The interior of the structure was cold and lifeless, the air thick with the scent of old concrete and rusted metal, and as he stepped further inside, the dim, flickering overhead lights cast erratic shadows against the walls, their uneven glow creating an unsettling, shifting pattern that made the space feel smaller than it was. It didn't take long before he saw them. The walls were covered in photographs. At first glance, they seemed random, an assortment of grainy images pinned haphazardly against the cracked concrete, some blurred, others sharp with unsettling clarity. But as Cade moved closer, his breath slowed, his pulse steady, even as the weight of what he was looking at settled into his bones. These weren't just surveillance photos of his shop before the fire, of his truck parked at the diner, of the grocery store where he had spoken to Henry. They weren't just recent images meant to track his movements over the past few days. Some of these were older, taken from places he had long since left behind, moments he had assumed no one had been watching. And at the very center of the display, positioned carefully, deliberately, was a black-and-white photograph, a single image of him and Raoul. The picture was dated, its edges slightly curled, but there was no mistaking it. It had been taken years ago, long before Raoul had been declared dead, before everything had fallen apart. The realization settled deep, an unspoken confirmation that this wasn't just about luring him back into the fight. This had been in motion for longer than he had ever imagined. Before he could react, the lights cut out. Darkness swallowed the space in an instant, the hum of the overhead fixtures dying, leaving nothing but silence in their wake. Cade's muscles tensed, his instincts kicking in, every fiber of his being screaming that he had walked directly into a controlled space, one where every movement had already been calculated. His body shifted, prepared for the next move. But then a voice broke through the stillness, low and measured, the words carrying no urgency, no anger, only a calm certainty that sent a chill through the air. "You took your time getting here." The sound came from the far end of the room, and as Cade's vision adjusted, a faint light flickered to life, revealing the outline of a figure standing just beyond the reach of the shadows. He didn't need to see the details to know who it was. Raoul had been waiting for him. Cade exhaled slowly, his fingers flexing at his sides as his mind locked onto the reality of what stood before him. He had spent the last few days chasing a ghost, searching for a man he had believed was long dead. But now, face to face with the truth, he understood that Raoul had never been the one hiding. Every step Cade had taken had been designed to lead him here. Every move had been orchestrated. And now, standing in the heart of the trap, he knew with absolute certainty that whatever was about to happen had already been decided long before he ever stepped through that door. Raoul had not just wanted him to come. Raoul had expected it. And Cade, standing there in the glow of that single flickering light, realized that the real game had only just begun. The silence between them was as heavy as the years they had spent apart. The space between them filled not just with time, but with the weight of something unfinished, something that had been waiting to come to a head for far longer than either of them would admit. The night stretched endlessly above them, the glow of the moon barely cutting through the darkness that wrapped around the abandoned lot behind the safe house, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see which of them would be the first to break. Cade had spent years hunting men like Raoul, tracking them across war zones and forgotten streets, but this wasn't like any of those missions. He wasn't staring down an enemy, wasn't facing a terrorist or a target with a bounty on his head. This was something far worse. This was a man who had once been his brother in arms, a man he had fought beside, a man he had believed had died long ago, a man who had spent years making sure Cade ended up standing right here. Raoul had planned every moment of this, had set the fire, had orchestrated every move that had forced Cade back into the hunt. And now, here he was, standing just a few feet away, watching Cade with the patience of someone who had already decided how this was going to end. "You've spent all this time chasing me," Raoul said, his voice steady, controlled, as if the conclusion of this meeting was inevitable. "And yet, even now, you still don't get it." Cade kept his breathing measured, his stance solid, his gaze locked onto Raoul's. But the truth was already settling. Deep inside him, a slow, creeping realization that made him feel as if the ground beneath his feet had shifted. "Then tell me," he said, his voice calm but unwavering. Raoul exhaled slowly, shaking his head slightly, something close to amusement flickering across his face. But there was no humor in it, only something colder, something that had been forged in years of waiting. "You don't even remember his name, do you?" The words were a knife, cutting through the distance between them, cutting into something that Cade hadn't even realized had been waiting to bleed. He had carried out so many missions, had erased so many names, had followed orders with the kind of precision that made men like him valuable. But now, standing here, faced with the consequences of one of those orders, he realized that this was the one that had never really left him. Raoul let the silence stretch, watching him, waiting. Then he spoke again, his voice quieter now, but sharp enough to draw blood. "Ivan Kessler." The name meant nothing at first. It was a name like any other, a target like any other. And then the memories surfaced. Cade's breath slowed, his mind sharpening as he pieced it together. "Dagestan," he murmured, almost to himself. "Operation Iron Dagger." Raoul's expression didn't shift. His voice was edged with steel. "You remember now?" Cade let out a slow breath, his stance unwavering, his tone carrying nothing but certainty. It was a mission. A classified black op. Ivan Kessler was an arms dealer funneling military-grade weapons into insurgent groups across Eastern Europe and the Middle East. He wasn't just funding them. He was equipping them with high-powered explosives, sniper rifles, and stolen U.S. ordnance. He put weapons in the hands of men who took out entire squads, executed civilians, bombed infrastructure to destabilize governments. We tracked him for months, followed the money, intercepted the supply lines, watched his movements until we had confirmation that he was making a deal with a warlord known for orchestrating mass civilian bombings. The directive was clear. Eliminate him. No capture, no extraction, just a kill order. Raoul's breathing had changed now, but Cade wasn't done. He was in an abandoned factory that night, second floor, surrounded by guards. My team went in under full blackout protocol. Halo jump, silent movement. I had the shot. One clean pull of the trigger. Ivan dropped. His warlord client tried to run. We put him down too. My team cleared the building in under 10 minutes. We exfiltrated. No casualties on our side. The mission was a success. His voice didn't waver, didn't shift, didn't carry an ounce of regret, because there was none. Raoul's fists clenched, his entire body tightening as something inside him snapped. His voice, when it came, was low and lethal. "He was my brother." The words hit Cade harder than he expected, but his expression didn't change. Ivan Kessler had been an arms dealer, a man who had armed killers. The blood of soldiers, of innocents, was on his hands, but he hadn't known, not until now. Cade exhaled, his voice even. "It wouldn't have changed anything." Raoul's breath hitched for half a second, but his fury didn't fade. "You're saying you still would have pulled the trigger?" Cade's gaze was locked onto his. "Yes." Raoul's fists tightened at his sides, his breathing steady but laced with something deeper. Something close to breaking. "You didn't even hesitate, did you?" Cade shook his head. "It was an order, Raoul. A necessary kill. I didn't question it. I didn't hesitate. I neutralized a target who was feeding weapons to the enemy. You think because he was your brother, that changes what he was? That changes what he did?" Raoul's teeth clenched, his body tensing like a predator about to pounce. "He was trying to get out," he snarled. "He called me. He wanted out." Cade met his gaze without flinching. He was too deep. "You don't just walk away from men like that, Raoul. You know it. I know it. Maybe he knew it too, but by the time he tried to run, it was too late. He made his choice, long before that night." Raoul exhaled sharply, his shoulders rising and falling in something that might have been exhaustion, or maybe it was just the weight of everything finally pressing down on him, finally being spoken aloud after years of silence. "I spent years watching you," he continued, his voice carrying something raw now, something that had nothing to do with hatred and everything to do with certainty. "Watching you move on, watching you build a life, watching you pretend that what we did, what you did, was just another mission, another name, another body." His gaze darkened. "But I didn't get to move on. I didn't get to bury it and walk away. While you were fixing cars and pretending you were done, I was living with the hole you left in my world." Cade's expression remained unreadable, but inside, he felt the weight of those words settle in a place that had never fully healed. Raoul stepped closer, voice lower now, but no less sharp. "You don't know what it's like to lose a brother." The words landed with finality, cutting through whatever air remained between them. And for the first time since this all began, Raoul's pain eclipsed his rage, but it didn't lessen his resolve. Cade exhaled slowly, but his voice remained steady. "So you burned my shop down, hunted me, put innocent people in danger, just to make me feel what you felt?" Raoul's face remained unreadable, But there was something in his eyes now. Something deeper than revenge. Something far worse. "I didn't want you to feel what I felt, Cade," he said, his voice unwavering. "Because you never could. You never lost a brother. You never had to watch your own blood spill and realize that the man responsible walked away without a second thought, that he moved on, that he built a life, while you were left with nothing but the void he carved into your world." He exhaled sharply. "You don't get to feel what I felt, but you will understand what it means to have everything taken from you." Cade watched him closely now, saw the flicker of something unresolved in his expression, the lingering echo of pain that had been driving him forward all this time. "So why fake your death?" Cade asked, his voice low but firm, cutting through the tension that had thickened around them. "Why disappear? You could have come for me years ago." Raoul tilted his head slightly, and for the first time, something close to a smirk ghosted across his lips. "Because I wanted to take my time," he admitted, his voice quiet, almost thoughtful. "I wanted to make sure when I came back, I wouldn't just kill you. That would have been too easy, too fast. I wanted to build something first, something that could make you suffer the way I did. I wanted you to watch everything you built burn to the ground before I ever laid a hand on you. And I wanted to be the one to bring you back into this world, because we both know you never really left it. Did you?" The truth settled into Cade's chest like a slow, sinking weight. And he understood now. Raoul had erased himself so he could reshape the world on his own terms. He hadn't wanted revenge in the heat of the moment. He had wanted control. He had wanted to be the one to dictate exactly when and how Cade would pay for what had been taken from him. "You're never going to stop, are you?" Cade asked, his voice quieter now, the finality of his own words settling deep in his bones. Raoul didn't hesitate. No, and Cade knew in that moment that this would not end in words, that there was no compromise, no path where they walked away from this unchanged. Raoul hadn't just come to destroy him. He had already decided that Cade was never going to truly live again. There was only one way this ended, and Cade, breathing steady, muscles tense, body already preparing for what was to come, was done running from it. The air between them felt thick, suffocating in a way that had nothing to do with the night and everything to do with the weight of what had been left unsaid. The open lot behind the safe house stretched around them, empty but heavy with the tension that neither of them had tried to diffuse. It had never been about peace, never about resolution. This had always been about the moment when words would no longer be enough, when all that remained between them was violence. Raoul stood a few feet away, his posture loose but coiled, like a man who had already made up his mind, but was giving Cade one last chance to understand before he ended it. His eyes, dark and unreadable, locked onto Cade's with a quiet intensity, one that held no hesitation, no uncertainty. "You're standing there like you think this can end some other way," Raoul said, his voice quiet but steady, like there's still something left to salvage. Cade exhaled slowly, keeping his stance neutral, his gaze unwavering. "There doesn't have to be another body buried over this." Raoul's lips twitched, something between amusement and bitterness flickering across his face. "No, Cade, there doesn't have to be, but there will be." He took a slow step forward, his movements deliberate, as if testing just how far Cade was willing to let him get before he reacted. "Because this isn't about what has to happen. This is about what needs to happen." Cade's jaw tightened, but his voice remained even. "You think killing me brings him back?" Raoul laughed, a low, sharp sound that held no real humor. "No, nothing brings him back. Nothing changes what happened." His smirk faded, his expression hardening. "But that's not the point, is it? The point is making sure you don't get to walk away from it clean." Cade tilted his head slightly, watching him carefully. "So, that's what this is? You don't want justice. You just want to ruin me." Raoul's eyes darkened. "You ruined yourself a long time ago. You just haven't admitted it yet." Cade let out a slow breath, rolling his shoulders, the tension settling deep into his muscles as he felt the moment drawing closer, felt the space between them narrowing in ways that had nothing to do with distance. "This doesn't bring him back," Cade repeated, softer this time, but no less firm. Raoul's gaze flickered for a moment, something unreadable flashing through his expression before it hardened once more. "No," he admitted, nodding slightly, "but it makes sure you never forget him." And then he moved. The shift was sudden, a blur of motion as Raoul closed the distance, his arm snapping forward in a quick, brutal strike aimed at Cade's throat. Cade reacted instantly, twisting out of the way, but Raoul was already pivoting, already adjusting, his knee driving up toward Cade's ribs with practiced precision. Cade blocked it with his forearm, the impact reverberating up his arm, but there was no time to think, no time to process. The fight had begun, and neither of them was going to stop until the other was down. Cade countered fast, stepping inside Raoul's reach and landing a solid elbow to his ribs, forcing him back a step. But Raoul didn't hesitate. He twisted with the impact, using Cade's momentum against him, driving a sharp palm strike toward Cade's jaw. Cade barely dodged in time, the force of the blow skimming past his face. But before he could retaliate, Raoul was already moving again, pressing forward with relentless, calculated strikes meant to dismantle him piece by piece. They had fought together once, had trained together, had bled together in places neither of them spoke about. They knew each other's movements, knew each other's strengths, knew exactly how the other would react before they even moved. That was what made this fight so dangerous. Raoul swept low, trying to take Cade's legs out from under him, but Cade anticipated it, jumping back just in time before lunging forward, tackling Raoul hard enough to drive him backward. They crashed into the side of the safe house, the impact sending a shudder through both of them. But Cade didn't let up. He threw a punch, aiming for Raoul's jaw, but Raoul dodged at the last second, the momentum carrying Cade just slightly off balance. Raoul took the opening, slamming his forehead into Cade's face with brutal force. Cade staggered back, pain exploding through his skull, blood already trickling from where Raoul's head had split his brow. His vision blurred for half a second, but he forced himself to recover, gritting his teeth against the pain as Raoul smirked. "Not bad," Raoul muttered, wiping blood from the corner of his mouth, "but you're still holding back." Cade inhaled sharply, shifting his stance, every muscle in his body burning but his focus sharper than ever. "You sure about that?" Raoul grinned, but there was no warmth in it. "Yeah, but don't worry. You won't be for long." And then they were at each other again, fists flying, bodies colliding in a brutal clash of skill and sheer will. There was no hesitation now, no restraint. The world around them had shrunk down to the fight, to the relentless rhythm of fists and feet meeting flesh, to the sharp crack of bone against bone, to the ragged, controlled breaths of two men refusing to break. The night blurred at the edges, reduced to the space between them, to the battle neither of them was willing to lose. Raoul struck first again, his movements fluid, sharp, efficient, a soldier trained for war, every attack aimed with the intent to dismantle, to control, to break. Cade barely dodged the first strike, a sharp elbow aimed for his temple, but the second landed, a vicious knee driving into his ribs, knocking the wind from his lungs. He gritted his teeth, pushing past the pain, catching Raoul's arm before the next blow could land, twisting hard and forcing him off balance. But Raoul had spent years fighting in places where balance didn't matter, where instinct and adaptation were the only things that kept a man alive. He twisted with Cade's hold, rolling into the momentum instead of resisting it, using his weight to drive them both to the ground. They hit hard, the impact rattling through them both, but neither hesitated. Cade struck first, his fist hammering into Raoul's ribs, feeling the sharp give of cartilage, a grunt of pain escaping Raoul's lips. It was the first real sound of damage Cade had heard from him. It wouldn't be the last. Raoul retaliated instantly, smashing his forehead into Cade's nose. A savage, unrelenting move that sent pain exploding through his skull, blood streaming instantly down his face. Cade barely had time to process the hit before Raoul was already on the offensive again, twisting out from under him, slamming a fist into Cade's jaw as they both staggered back to their feet. Neither man hesitated. Neither man backed down. They collided again. Two forces trained for war. Two soldiers who had spent their lives surviving by knowing exactly when to strike and when to endure. This wasn't just a fight. This was a battle of attrition, a test of who would break first. Raoul's hands were fast, precise, his attacks relentless, keeping Cade moving, keeping him reacting instead of controlling the fight. He feinted left, drew Cade's guard up, then struck low, his shin smashing against Cade's side in a brutal roundhouse kick that sent a sharp bolt of pain through his ribs. Cade staggered back half a step, but refused to fall. Raoul came in for another strike, this time aiming for Cade's throat. A clean kill if it landed. Cade caught his wrist at the last second, twisting sharply, using Raoul's own momentum against him, sending him crashing to the ground. But Raoul rolled instantly, pushing off with his hands, coming back up in a fluid motion, his breathing controlled despite the damage he had already taken. Cade spat blood to the side, wiping his face with the back of his hand, his body aching, but his mind sharper than ever. He had fought too many men like Raoul before, men who had trained to win, men who believed in control above all else. But this wasn't war. This wasn't an operation. This was something far more personal. And that made Raoul dangerous. "You're slowing down," Raoul muttered, his breathing steady. But there was a tightness to his voice now, a crack in the control he had maintained throughout the fight. Cade exhaled sharply, rolling his shoulders. "You always talk this much when you're losing?" Raoul's smirk was quick, but it didn't reach his eyes. He rushed in again, faster this time, more aggressive, abandoning the measured precision of his earlier attacks. He wanted to end this now. Cade met him head-on, ducking low, slipping past the first strike, planting his feet and driving his fist into Raoul's ribs again, this time with everything he had. Raoul staggered. It was slight, barely noticeable, but Cade saw it, saw the way his body reacted just half a second too late, saw the momentary lapse in control. He pressed the advantage, stepping forward, throwing a sharp jab into Raoul's face, following with a second strike to his ribs, targeting the same spot he had already injured. Raoul grunted, but instead of retreating, he grabbed Cade by the collar of his shirt, yanking him forward, their faces inches apart. "You think this ends with me?" Raoul's voice was rough now, strained, the pain in his body starting to seep into his words. Cade's grip tightened on Raoul's arm, his knee shooting up and slamming into Raoul's gut. He felt the air leave Raoul's lungs, felt the way his body instinctively curled in from the blow. But Raoul didn't let go. Instead, he threw them both backward, sending them crashing into the dirt. They rolled, bodies tangled, fists still swinging even as they hit the ground, neither willing to let the other get the upper hand. Cade slammed his elbow into Raoul's face, feeling the crunch of impact, but Raoul twisted, ignoring the pain, wrapping an arm around Cade's throat, locking in a chokehold. Cade's body reacted instantly, muscles tightening as he felt the pressure cut into his airflow. He drove his elbow back into Raoul's side once, twice, 3 times, each hit sending a jolt of pain through his opponent's body. But Raoul held on, gritting his teeth, refusing to let go. Cade knew he had seconds before the hold cut off his oxygen completely. Instead of fighting against it, he shifted his weight, using Raoul's grip against him, rolling into the choke instead of away from it, breaking Raoul's hold just enough to slip free. He twisted, reversing their positions, slamming Raoul's back against the dirt, pressing his forearm against his throat. Raoul struggled, but Cade had leverage now, pressing down, pinning him, both of them breathing hard, bodies battered, blood staining the dirt beneath them. Neither man moved for a moment, both holding on, both refusing to break. But only one of them was going to walk away from this, and Cade was about to make sure of it. Cade's breath came slow and deep, his body aching, his muscles screaming from the unrelenting brutality of the fight. Raoul was pinned beneath him, their bodies covered in dirt and blood, both of them exhausted, but still refusing to let this end. The ground beneath them was damp with sweat and violence, but the battle was far from over. Raoul gritted his teeth, struggling beneath Cade's weight, but Cade had him locked down, his arm pressed against Raoul's throat just hard enough to remind him that one wrong move could end it all. But Raoul had never been one to go quietly. A shift in his grip, a sudden twist of his fingers, and before Cade could react, Raoul's hand shot toward his waistband. Cade saw the movement too late. The glint of steel caught the faint light, the blade of a Swiss knife flicking open in an instant. Raoul drove it forward. Cade barely moved in time, twisting his body just enough that the knife slashed across his side instead of plunging into his gut. Pain flared, sharp and immediate, but he didn't let it slow him. Raoul had crossed a line now. No more bare fists, no more honor. This was about survival. Raoul used the momentary distraction to shove Cade off, rolling free and getting to his feet, his chest rising and falling hard, the knife gleaming in his bloodied grip. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, smirking despite the bruises swelling across his face. "You really thought this was going to end with just our fists?" Raoul asked, his voice rough, his stance shifting back into readiness, the knife dancing between his fingers. "You always were too idealistic." Cade exhaled, steadying himself despite the pain throbbing from his side, blood soaking into his shirt. He had fought men with weapons before. Raoul was fast, deadly, but he wasn't unpredictable. Cade knew how he thought, knew his movements, knew the way he calculated his kills. Raoul lunged again, the knife flashing through the air in a precise arc aimed for Cade's ribs. Cade dodged, but the blade nicked his arm, the sharp sting barely registering over the adrenaline pumping through his veins. Raoul pressed forward, the strikes quick, the knife slicing through the air between them, forcing Cade to stay on the defensive, dodging by inches, waiting for his moment. Raoul was skilled, but Cade had learned long ago that knives weren't about speed. They were about opportunity. And Raoul was getting desperate. Cade waited, watching, letting Raoul think he was pushing him back, his own movements calculated, forcing Raoul to overcommit. And then he did. Raoul swung wide, aiming for Cade's throat. But the strike was just a fraction too aggressive, a fraction too eager to finish the fight. Cade saw his opening. He caught Raoul's wrist, mid-swing, twisting violently. The knife clattered to the ground, but Cade didn't stop there. He yanked Raoul forward, locking his arm, flipping him over his shoulder. Raoul hit the ground hard, his breath leaving him in a sharp gasp. But Cade wasn't done. Before Raoul could react, Cade straddled him, grabbing his wrist and twisting it behind his back, his other arm wrapping around Raoul's throat in a chokehold so tight there was no escape. Raoul struggled, his body jerking, but Cade's hold was unbreakable. Cade's grip tightened, his muscles burning, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. He could end this. Right here. Right now. A little more pressure. A little longer. He could feel Raoul weakening beneath him, his body beginning to slow, his breaths coming shorter. This was it. This was justice. This was vengeance. And yet, it wasn't. Cade's grip faltered for a split second, and in that moment, the weight of everything crashed down on him. Killing Raoul wouldn't undo the past. It wouldn't bring his brother back. It wouldn't erase the destruction Raoul had caused. It wouldn't change what had been taken from both of them, but it would change Cade, and that realization settled deep inside him, heavier than the fight itself. Raoul felt the hesitation, his body stilling beneath Cade's grip, his breath ragged. He let out a sharp, bitter laugh. barely more than a whisper. "You can't do it, can you?" His voice was hoarse, strained from the lack of air. "You're still pretending you're the better man." Cade exhaled sharply, his grip tightening for half a second. Not enough to kill, but enough to remind Raoul that he could, that he was making a choice. And then he let go. Raoul coughed violently, rolling onto his side, sucking in deep, ragged breaths, his body trembling from the fight, from the edge he had been hanging over. He didn't move to attack, didn't reach for the knife still lying in the dirt between them. He just lay there, staring at Cade through bruised, bloodshot eyes, something unreadable flickering across his expression. Cade pushed himself up, his body screaming in protest, his hands shaking as the last remnants of adrenaline coursed through his veins. He had won. And yet, standing over Raoul, he didn't feel like a victor. "You're wrong about me," Cade said finally, his voice rough but steady. "I'm not pretending to be the better man." He looked down at Raoul, his chest rising and falling with exhaustion. "I just refuse to be like you." Raoul chuckled, the sound dry, bitter, broken. "Maybe that's worse." Cade didn't respond. The fight was over. But what came next? That was something neither of them knew. For now, Cade turned away. And Raoul, still lying in the dirt, didn't try to stop him. The dust settled. The night stretched quiet. And for the first time in years, there was nothing left to fight for. Raoul sat on the ground, bloodied and broken, the fire in his eyes flickering but not entirely gone. Cade stood over him, chest heaving, the weight of every decision pressing down on him. They had torn each other apart, ripped open old wounds, and in the end, it had never been about winning. Raoul coughed, shaking his head as he wiped blood from his mouth. "You should have killed me," he muttered, voice rough, barely above a whisper. "That's how this kind of thing ends." Cade exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Not this time." Raoul chuckled, low and bitter. "You always were too stubborn for your own good." Cade wiped sweat and blood from his brow, his body screaming in protest. But there was no hesitation in him anymore. He wasn't the man Raoul wanted him to be. Raoul met his gaze, something shifting in his expression, something that wasn't anger, wasn't hatred, it wasn't quite understanding, but it was close. He nodded once, slow, accepting. "So, what now?" Cade glanced down at him, jaw tightening. "Now, you answer for what you've done." Raoul let out a slow breath, head tilting slightly, his exhaustion finally settling in. "You really think you can bring me in?" His voice wasn't mocking, just curious. "A ghost like me? You stopped being a ghost the second you set fire to my world," Cade said. Raoul didn't argue. He didn't try to run, didn't resist when Cade pulled out his radio and made the call. 15 minutes later, the wail of sirens cut through the quiet night. The police arrived in force, tactical units moving in with precision, weapons trained, orders sharp and clipped. But there was no fight left in Raoul. He sat there, bloodied and bruised, staring into the distance as if the battle had drained everything from him. When they hauled him to his feet, he barely reacted, only glancing once at Cade before offering the faintest hint of a smirk. "Guess this is where our story ends." Cade met his gaze, unreadable. "No, this is where your story finally catches up with you." The officers shoved Raoul into the back of a waiting cruiser, the doors slamming shut behind him. For the first time in years, Raoul Kessler wasn't a ghost. He was a man caught in the weight of his own actions. As the convoy of police vehicles disappeared into the night, Cade felt something settle inside him. Not satisfaction, not victory, but closure. It wasn't the ending Raoul had wanted, but it was the one he had earned. Raoul might have orchestrated the war, but he hadn't fought it alone. His reach had extended into the gang that had tried to take over the streets, the same men who had burned Cade's shop, who had tried to make this city their own through fear and violence. But with Raoul gone, the foundation crumbled. Trez's organization had already been weakened, fractures forming as soon as Cade had started cutting through them, and now the last of them were scattered. Some fled town before law enforcement could track them down. Others turned on each other, and the unlucky ones were caught in the wave of arrests that followed. Names that had once controlled entire neighborhoods were now nothing more than prisoners waiting for sentencing. By the time the dust settled, the gang was done. No more extortion, no more fear, no more control. The city was finally free. The town didn't just move on. They reclaimed what had been taken. The scars left behind by the gang's reign of fear slowly faded, replaced by something stronger. Businesses reopened without the shadow of extortion hanging over them. People walked the streets without glancing over their shoulders, and the weight that had once pressed down on the neighborhood lifted, piece by piece. It wasn't just about the arrests, or the fact that the gang had been dismantled. It was about the people, about the way they had come together, stood their ground, refused to be intimidated. What had started as fear had turned into something unshakable, a quiet understanding that they had fought back and won, and in the end, that mattered more than anything. The fire had taken Cade's shop, but in its place, something new had risen. Not just walls and steel, but a reminder that no matter how much destruction tried to break them, this town would always rebuild. For the first time in a long time, Cade Vassar had nothing left to fight. No enemies waiting in the shadows, no ghosts whispering from the past, no war demanding his return. The weight that had settled in his chest for years had lifted, not all at once, but gradually, with each step he had taken toward reclaiming what was his. The past had come for him, had tried to drag him under, but he had come out standing. The shop wasn't finished yet, but it was more than just a pile of steel and lumber now. It had taken shape, a framework of something new, something stronger than before. He still had work to do, but for the first time, that work didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a choice. As he stood outside, watching the last of the volunteers packing up for the day, he found himself appreciating the quiet, not the kind of silence that came with waiting for the next fight, but the kind that came with knowing the fight was finally over. Henry walked up beside him, hands in his pockets, his usual smirk softened by something that almost resembled pride. "You did good," he said simply, nodding toward the shop. Cade huffed, shaking his head. "Didn't do it alone." "No," Henry agreed. "But you stuck around long enough to see it through." He glanced at Cade, his expression turning more thoughtful. "That's new for you, ain't it?" Cade didn't answer right away. He let the question settle, let himself think about what it meant, because Henry wasn't wrong. For years, he had been running from war, from the past, from the weight of everything he'd lost. But he wasn't running anymore. For the first time in a long time, Cade Vassar wasn't running from war. He was building something worth fighting for. And this time, no one would burn it down. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.